relationship between Queen Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, is legendary and gets a lot of coverage. But the Queen's later in life romance with the French prince, Francois, Duke of Anjou, is seldom explored at great length, despite the clear affection for which the two felt for each other, and the fact that perhaps this was the man that Elizabeth came closest to marrying. So why so? What was this union all about? How did they feel about each other, and why did the marriage never go ahead? Well, to discuss all of this and more, I'm pleased to welcome historian David Lee onto the podcast. In 2023, David's book, The Queen's Frog Prince, The Courtship of Elizabeth I and the Duke of Anjou, was released and acts as the basis for our conversation. So get comfortable and prepare to learn all about an aspect of Elizabeth I's life that rarely gets the attention that it deserves. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 84, Elizabeth and Anjou, the Queen's Frog Prince, with David Lee. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast, David Lee. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me again.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm really looking forward to this conversation because we're here today to talk about the courtship between Elizabeth I and the Duke of Anjou. You wrote a book about this very subject, The Queen's Frog Prince, which is the basis really for today's conversation. But before we get into that, a few questions for people to get to know you a bit better. So can you provide me with a short introduction into your background, where you grew up and what it is that you now do full time?
Yeah, sure. Obviously, if anybody doesn't know, I'm Irish. I think anybody listening would know. I grew up on the east coast of Ireland in a town called Wicklow, and I now live in what's considered the Midlands in Kildare. So it's very quiet, very country, really peaceful. But I do work in the city centre in Dublin. The capital. So there's that. I don't write or I suppose research history full time. I will consider myself a Sunday historian. I've studied history. I did a BA in history. I did a BA thesis on Anne Boleyn. And for my MA thesis, I actually delved into female, I suppose, land ownership and a little bit about mental illness. In the 19th century. So, yeah, it's really a mixed bag with my historical background. But full-time, I actually, and this is funny, I teach adults in IT.
You teach adults in IT?
Basically, is the simplest way I can actually explain it to you and the listeners. I was a data analyst for an Irish-American company about the product itself. So day-to-day, I'm actually a teacher for adults, yeah.
I see, okay. So what sparked your passion for Tudor history then?
Probably a mixture of my dad. My dad's British. My dad's from London. And he moved to Ireland when he was a child. And he always, told me stories about Elizabeth and, the great English monarchs. And my grandfather was the same. My grandfather lived here as well later. And I think there's a sense of being proud to be British on that side of the family. And so I fell in love with the history because they loved the history. And also I think probably also my mom's friend, who actually happened to be my history teacher in secondary school, he had a great way of teaching. And I think that's so important. And for me, he really just allowed me to delve into, especially the Tudors, but history as a whole. And yeah, I think it's just inspirational people who loved history as well helped me just find that love of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. That tends to be the case that, when there's that someone around you who's really passionate about it, it does rub off on you for sure.
Totally. Yeah.
So because of today's conversation, if you could go back and jump in a time travel machine and ask Elizabeth I one question, what would it be?
Oh my God, we'd need a whole banquet or a dinner. I'd have so much to ask her. I think in this context, what we're talking about today, I would really love to understand her mind in terms of love. So I would definitely want to know what she really thought of the Duke of Anjou, but I really would love to know where everything lay with Robert Dudley. You know, it's a fascinating relationship they had, and really it's always fascinated me, even before I came across the Duke of Anjou, because I came across the Duke of Anjou story much later. By accident. I mean, not many people really think about him, and everyone thinks about Robert Dudley, and I'm guilty of that as well. So I would love to know. I don't want to know the ins and outs of their relationship. You know, we don't. There's only so much we need to know, but I really want to know: was he the love of her life, or was it somebody else? Was it the Duke of Anjou? Unlikely, but was it actually? Did she have one? So I would love to talk about Elizabeth's emotions with her, if I could, because that's something she didn't get to do.
Yes. And is there a Tudor misconception that you would love to change? Is there something that sort of really grinds your gears that people constantly go on about that is actually inaccurate?
Yeah, actually. And it's the thing that it might surprise you, and it really might surprise others, because I know a lot of other historians and authors concentrate on it quite a bit. I think there's so much more to Elizabeth in terms of like her vanity and her frivolity. I think it's kind of at this stage of the narrative and our research kind of superficial. I think people often reduce her image to, you know, the white makeup, the wigs, the portraits, the teeth, you know, as if she was just obsessed with her appearance. And I'm not saying that she wasn't, but her image really was her armor. So she understood the power of spectacle in politics better than most rulers before her, and I think after her. So I think this so-called vanity was actually a form of self-preservation and authority. For me, after conducting my research during this book, I'm on my second book, I don't think it was about beauty for Elizabeth. I actually think it was about control. And yes, many historians have mentioned that, but I love to delve into that political side of her beauty and vanity rather than what it looked like in itself.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point because, yes, as you say, the prevailing argument is that this is a woman who was extremely vain, and that constant application of thick makeup was all about preserving the mask of youth as it's known. But actually, to your point, it's about control in as much as anything else.
Yes, I think she definitely had to protect herself, and she cultivated that image herself. It's hers to create, to control. And yes, it was there to protect her, and she did it very well. And I think other monarchs and world leaders do the same and have, taken a leaf from her book, for sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the late Queen always said, didn't she, that I have to be seen to be believed, which is why she always wore bright colours. That's, I suppose, another way of control and making sure that people know who she is.
Yeah, and also that sense of mystery. That's what keeps control. I think that's what keeps it going. And I think the late Queen Elizabeth II really understood that as well, probably as much as Elizabeth I.
I would say so, yeah. So we're here today, as I said at the start of the episode, to talk about the Duke of Anjou and his. So you wrote a book a while ago, The Queen's Frog Prince, The Courtship of Elizabeth I and the Duke of Anjou. Early in your book, you explore the ways in which Elizabeth rewrote how and what a Queen Regnant could be, almost merging the male and the female, but nonetheless maintaining and flaunting her femininity. So can you expand on this for me? How did it serve Elizabeth in ways that it failed her sister?
That's a really interesting question. And I did touch on it in the book, and I have touched on this before in the past. And I've muddled on a similar question for some time. But I really think that Elizabeth rewrote the traditional role of monarch. So I think that she basically blended the expected traits of a ruler. So, I don't know, maybe decisiveness, strength, and authority. But she embraced her femininity with it. So she used her gender to her advantage, which symbolized her ability to, be both powerful, but also, as a woman, nurturing. So on the topic of Mary, I think her sister Mary failed to combine the two effectively. I think the idea was there, but I think it's partly due to her more rigid and traditional understanding of what womanhood was. And Elizabeth leveraged the femininity as an integral part of the identity rather than separating them as Mary did. I really ultimately think she combined masculine authority with the nurturing aspects of womanhood, which appealed to, I suppose, maybe the men of her court, even the women of her court, and then the public as a whole. So I think this approach worked for her in ways that it failed Mary. It helped her maintain her power. And it meant she didn't have to surrender her role as a monarch because she was a woman.
Yeah. I mean, she actually spoke quite often, didn't she, in the third person about herself, and would use masculine phrasing when referring to calling herself a prince rather than a princess.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And I feel she understood this. She knew where she could bend. And I don't want to say, use the term gender bending as we do today, especially in the queer community. But I do think she knew how to lever femininity and then masculinity and use it to her advantage when she wanted, without pushing boundaries or gender norms.
Yeah.
So they knew she's a woman. She knows she's a woman, but she is monarch and she has to have a certain touch of masculinity without it being overt or actually masculine. She understood it very well.
Yeah. I think she also benefited in the way that Mary did, and also from youth, because she had more time to solidify her rule. And actually, Mary gets a very unfair rap, I think, on the whole. But one of the things I think a lot of people don't always pick up on is how much Elizabeth actually piggybacked off things that Mary had started, but she just didn't see to fruition because she reigned for so fleeting a time.
I agree. I think we talked about this before, you and I, where, what if Mary actually had the time to, continue her reign? And yes, remember her as, I certainly don't remember her as Bloody Mary. I think all of the Tudors were equally as bloody, to be honest. But if she had more time, what would her reign have become? Would we celebrate her in the way we celebrate Elizabeth? And I think it's so hard to tell. And I think there's so much more to Mary as well.
Yes. So you also quite early on reflect on the relationship between Elizabeth I and her chief counsellor, Sir William Cecil Lord Burghley. Now, the two formed a very strong working relationship. I think he is undoubtedly was her right hand. But it was one that wasn't without challenges. And one of those challenges was marriage. So how constant was the pressure placed on Elizabeth by Cecil to marry? Was it a constant?
Yeah, I think it was. Cecil, as her chief advisor, was immensely concerned with her political position and the future of the dynasty, the Tudor dynasty. So the pressure he placed on her to marry was constant, and it stemmed from both political but also, I think, practical concerns. He wanted her to be, secure and preserve the stability of the throne, as Elizabeth's, her single status made that succession really uncertain. So him proposing several suitors to Elizabeth over the years, it's not something that was extreme, and maybe it was constant, but she resisted. She always balanced, her personal independence with those political obligations. She kind of, I suppose, led Cecil on a little bit, and I think this really frustrated him. His pressure wasn't just about marriage. This was literally ensuring the survival of the Tudor line and the Elizabethan state that he really helped create. So that concern really weighed heavily on him throughout their working relationship and his whole life, I think, until the end of his days. I really think he wanted her to marry, but I think he wanted her to marry the man he wanted her to marry.
Yes.
Someone once said to me, it's a fascinating question. It's really deep. But someone once asked me, what about Elizabeth and Cecil, in terms of, their relationship? Was there, in any other, on any other planet or any other universe, was there room for them, to have a relationship? And I thought, this is a preposterous question. But actually, as humans, as two individuals, they're very well suited to each other. They're very good friends. They're not just colleagues. He's not just a supporter of her because she's a Protestant and because of her values. They really got on. And he wanted her to be happy. He wanted her to not just ensure the succession, he wanted her to be genuinely happy. And so maybe in some far out universe, they would have been perfect for each other, but he loved Mildred. So, and I just, I feel like he cared for her and he wanted her to be happy.
Do you believe that Elizabeth made the decision to never marry even before taking the throne? And if so, why? Because surely she would have known that, therefore it would be the end of her dynasty.
Yeah. Well, it's really hard to say. I think it's likely that she had already begun considering her status as a virgin before taking the throne, given her experiences. So, the political dynamics of court, particularly with the failure of her sister's marriage to a Spaniard and the threats posed by foreign suitors, I think they probably shaped her decision overall. Well, let's remember her mother's marriage. She would have been constantly reminded of that, during her youth, her status. Then there's, the situation with Thomas Seymour and how, things can go wrong, and how ultimately women were treated in marriage. And I think she was acutely aware of the dangers marriage could bring to her independence as, if not as a princess or, the Lady Elizabeth before, definitely as queen. And so I think she understood that any marriage would really risk her sovereignty and power. And there's that fear, I suppose, of losing control of her reign. It likely played a large role in her decision to remain single, even with, the Courtship of Anjou. I think it's really the point.
Yeah. And again, she benefited from the ability that her sister didn't have, which is that she was able to witness how Mary's marriage actually grossly undermined her reign in many ways. For lots of people, it really was a challenging union. So she had that benefit that I suppose Mary didn't. And also Elizabeth was alive and very aware of what happened to Catherine Howard. And I think that, again, there's often been claims that it was Catherine Howard's execution that in a way impacted her mentally a lot more than her mother's would have done, because she was old enough to understand what was going on by that point.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that, Elizabeth didn't know her mother. I suppose, she didn't remember her. Let's be honest, she probably didn't. She was almost 3 when her mother died. And she would have a memory of Catherine Howard. She would have a memory of Anne of Cleves and Catherine Parr. And let's be honest, none of those women fared very well, especially Catherine Howard. And after all, with Catherine Parr and, her situation and her marriage with Thomas Seymour and her death, her sad, untimely death, due to childbed fever, they say. Of course, Elizabeth, thought about not marrying. Of course, she considered the dangers of it. And I also looked at this in the book, and I went down many rabbit holes during this research, but I did find that Elizabeth was terrified of the idea of pregnancy and childbirth. She really was. So I think marriage for her wasn't the main issue. If you take away, the fact that she's a woman and that a man could step in and take away her sovereignty. It's also the physical implications of marriage and what that means for her and her body and her life. And so we forget about that in today's day and age as well. It's dangerous to be a married woman in Tudor England, especially, for someone that has so much to lose.
So introduce the Duke of Anjou for me. Who was he and what was his position within the French royal family?
Sure. So first of all, I want to say that I didn't start this, this project intentionally. I actually fell upon the Duke of Anjou. I came across a letter by accident. I was actually researching something completely different. I was researching something about Anne Boleyn, and I found a letter, I think, from the Duke of Anjou, or maybe from Elizabeth to the Duke, and I was like, what is this? And I put it away for later. But anyway, the Duke of Anjou, so he was born around 1555, and his real name was actually Francis or Francois. And he was the younger son of King Henry II of France and Catherine de' Medici. So he was a French prince. He was 4th in line. And by the time he came into consideration as a suitor for Elizabeth, he had become the Duke of Anjou and had become, I suppose, a prominent figure in the French court. When his brother, before he became king, he himself was actually Duke of Anjou. So Francis was actually Duke of Alençon, but his brother becomes king, and then he's moved up a little bit. And he was seen as a potential heir to the throne of France after the death of his elder brother. So his position in the French court, and I suppose in royal family, made him a significant figure in the context of marriage, and so negotiations with Elizabeth. So I think overall, Anjou provided a strong political alliance with England. I think he gave possibility possibilities for Elizabeth that she would never have known she had.
Am I right in thinking though that his actual name at birth was Hercule? It wasn't actually Francois.
Absolutely, I mentioned this in the book. Actually, yeah, it was Hercule, or I suppose we could say now Hercules. But in a way, yes, it was, and his name was. I think there's many reasons for his, change of name. I think Francois or Francis. It's much more French, actually, and I think as things change, kings die, princes, move up. I think they wanted to give him a much more French identity, but.
Right.
That's just a theory. That's just a theory of one or other historians as well. I think we don't really know the reason, but yeah, after a certain point in late childhood, early adolescence, he was referred to as Francis or Francois. Yeah,
I see. Okay.
Interesting.
So, at what point was he being? When was the first point that he's mooted as a potential suitor to Elizabeth I?
Well, I think he was first seriously, and I mean seriously, considered by Elizabeth in the late 1570s. So by that time, Elizabeth was, she's getting older. She's facing increasing pressure from her council, in particular William Cecil, to marry. She's already rejected, many suitors, so including potential matches from Spain and other parts of Europe. So I think he kind of presented, something unique. He was young, passionate, unfortunately for her, Catholic, but he could be seen as useful and politically. So why not?
Elizabeth is famous for batting off potential suitors quite regularly. So what made her more open to this particular match?
I think it's the fact that it's French. I don't think it's the fact fully that it's Anjou. I think an alliance with France seemed to offer her both personal and political benefit. So considering England's ongoing conflict with Spain, this made sense. England and France were old enemies, and now England and Spain were enemies. And there was, decades before, an incredible alliance between Spain and England. And so alliances change. And so I think it came to the point where it's a necessity, and France was just there, and it happened to have a prince.
And I suspect a little bit that there was that thing for Elizabeth as well, knowing she would have obviously known that her mother was a great Francophile and not particularly fond of the Spanish. So there might have been a bit of that going on as well, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's something Elizabeth inherited. She loved, the idea of French fashion, just as her mother did. It doesn't mean she didn't like Spanish things. But by the time, the 1570s roll over, it's kind of... Elizabethan court is very anti-Spanish, and in terms of fashion and kind of ideology and court etiquette, it's very French, and so it makes sense. There's links with the French court. There's already existing links, so I just think it was presented at the perfect time for her.
So, what was the age gap here? Because surely by this point Elizabeth is getting older, and what is the age gap? And if it's quite big, surely the expectation of pregnancies would have been quite low.
Yeah, well, the age gap is the one thing that kind of startled me with Elizabeth and Anjou. It was quite significant. It was almost 22 years,
Wow.
And so Elizabeth was almost 45 by the time the courtship really began in earnest. So while Anjou was in his late 20s, here comes almost 45-year-old Queen of England saying, hey, so let's negotiate something.
He'd have been like 22, 23 then, actually. If she was 45 and he was in his early 20s.
Yeah, she was approaching 45. So yeah, he was in his early 20s. So it's like, even for the time, we're so used to seeing young women in the Tudor period marry, slightly older men. And this just turns it on its head. And I guess that's kind of the idea of, Elizabeth also balancing, that kind of sense of gender and authority as well. I mean, she's older. She's the more senior in this relationship in terms of age. And I think in terms of pregnancy, the age gap did reduce expectations of pregnancy, particularly because Elizabeth was already at an age where, childbearing would not have been very common. And if so, very difficult. And again, like I said, she had, a deep fear, it seems, of the idea of pregnancy or having a child. But the focus of the marriage discussions, I think, were less about actually producing an heir. So it's less about Elizabeth getting pregnant and more about the political ramifications of a union. So like it's more about the alliance, especially for like William Cecil and the council. Yes, there is the pressing issue of the succession, but the most pressing thing is the threat of Spain. Okay. So I think the marriage was seen as a way to solidify, I suppose, a powerful political alliance where pregnancy just wasn't the primary concern of the council or Elizabeth.
Because I think there was also, I think one of the things that we tend to forget about quite a lot is that when people obsess over why didn't Elizabeth have children, but I think we forget that there were heirs. The crown wasn't going to just go to a random person out of nowhere. There were heirs, they just weren't of her body.
Yeah.
And to that end, I think it makes sense that the marriage for the purposes of alliance and not, they knew there weren't going to be children if she's in her late 40s by this point. So I think that's something people often overlook.
Yeah, I think people, they don't realise, the ramifications of what pregnancy would look like for Elizabeth, and they concentrate so much on that, and they don't see the wider landscape. There's many cousins. There's not just Mary Queen of Scots. There's the Grey sisters. There's male cousins. That are
you've got the old descendants of. Well, you've got a great grandson of Margaret Pole was
absolutely. Yeah, there's many potential heirs. And we know, look at Elizabeth's, grandfather, he, had very, flimsy claim to the throne, but he got there, he got the Tudors on the throne. Like, it could be anyone, it could have been anyone. And she was right not to mention names as much as possible when it came to heir. She never wanted to name an heir. And I just think, marriage may have suited her, but I just think the whole idea for her of bearing children and becoming, just a woman that produces heirs to serve it in the seas, it just didn't suit her and who she was.
So in the recent second series of The Serpent Queen, and forgive me if you haven't watched it, but I
love it, by the way.
Okay, cool. I loved it as well. I know a lot of people struggled with it.
No, I liked it. Yeah.
I loved it because maybe because I don't know a huge amount about Catherine de Medici beyond the basics, that some of the things that a lot of people had issues with maybe kind of went over my head. But as a piece of drama, I found it very entertaining.
Yeah, look, I kind of see it the way you do. Like, I can separate, the reality and the actual historical accuracy and enjoy, a Tudor or, a French kind of version, Catherine Medici drama. I can enjoy all of it. I like the Tudors. Did I like Reign? Yeah. No, I didn't like that. But I can see the potential of this series, and people that love Catherine de Medici do complain. Yeah. I've seen it online. Well, I liked it. It's it's interesting. Yeah. It's a banger. And, it might not be historically accurate, but we can enjoy it.
Yeah. I loved Diane de Poitiers. I thought she was a scream.
Absolutely. An iconic. I have to say, like, the fashion, the clothing, the way they displayed, courtiers in The Serpent Queen, it was just magnificent.
Yeah,
it was really, really beautiful.
Yeah, it was brilliant. And I'm with you on Reign. I got 5 minutes into Reign and just turned off. I was like, there's a character called Lola set in the 16th century.
Oh, I saw Lola. I was like, who's called Lola? Like
that well-known 16th century name, Lola.
Yeah, Lola. And the dresses, like, seriously.
It was like they went to Topshop and just thought that'll do.
Honestly, it's like, what, like the stringy top, like it's basically a top, not even a dress. I'm like, where's the corset? Where's the shape? What's going on here? I actually watched the whole thing. I did. Once I start something, I have to.
But so based on in the second season of The Serpent Queen, it paints the negotiations around the proposed marriage between Elizabeth and the Duke of Anjou as being very driven personally by Elizabeth and Catherine de Medici directly. How much truth is there in this? Was Catherine strategizing just as much as Elizabeth in this particular subject?
I think there is some truth to the idea that both Elizabeth and Catherine were strategically involved in the negotiations, but I think it's important to understand their context. So Catherine did work tirelessly to promote the idea of marriage between Anjou and Elizabeth. And Elizabeth herself was always at the centre of the decision-making. So Catherine de Medici wants to control what she can. She's pushing the ball. Elizabeth, receives it. And then she's this one saying, yes, no. And so she used negotiations as a diplomatic tool to maintain her own independence. But she also liked to play France against Spain and other European powers. So where Catherine de' Medici was indeed, she was shrewd, but she was also navigating the complexities of her own political struggles in France. So both women are navigating struggles. And so I think Elizabeth was in control of the negotiations overall. So she ensured the match remained beneficial to her. Sure, Catherine wanted it to be beneficial to France, but ultimately Elizabeth is the de facto bride. And so the ball really was in her court.
You said that Elizabeth began the courtship. In the book, you say that she begins the courtship with an agenda. So what was that agenda?
I think Elizabeth's agenda in the courtship with Anjou was really multifaceted. So on one level, she wanted to maintain, I suppose, England's sovereignty to ensure control over the throne, the basics, without giving away too much power to a foreign prince. But then she was using the courtship also to create diplomatic leverage. So again, against Spain. So I suppose the proposed marriage gave Elizabeth a powerful tool to negotiate with both Catholic and Protestant powers. So she sought to maintain her image as monarch without, I suppose, remaining above the political fray. Ultimately, I think her agenda was political, but it became emotional. And that's when the research for me turned, because we all say Elizabeth dangled, many princes, many men, but she did. But this is different. What it became is like no other courtship that Elizabeth had, at least that we don't know. We don't have, so many letters between Elizabeth and Robert Dudley. But we do have many from Elizabeth Anjou. And what they say is that this was an emotional courtship, an emotional relationship. And so she had an agenda, but it became something else.
Mm-hmm. So France, as part of the negotiations, France supplied a list of provisions that they wanted in place to ensure that the match went ahead, and these were provisions that Elizabeth essentially ignored. So what were they, and why did Elizabeth dislike what was being asked of her?
Well, I think for Elizabeth, France's provisions were quite significant. I think these really are what started to turn her, give her anxiety about the idea of this courtship and where it was going. So basically they wanted Elizabeth to agree to like a formal treaty that would grant Anjou certain powers in England. So secure French influence in her court, which is a no-no for Elizabeth. So one of the key provisions, for example, was that Anjou would have a say in England's foreign policy, particularly in regards to the Netherlands, which is a no again for Elizabeth. So she strongly disliked the terms. I think all of them she disliked because they threatened her control over England's policies and would have undermined her sovereignty as a whole. So it's literally like France is saying, yeah, you can marry him, but he's taken over. He's taken the reins. And Elizabeth's like, no. So I don't think she was willing to give up the power to a foreign prince, especially one, as young and inexperienced as a fourth son. And I just think these terms seemed to go too far in demanding concessions. I mean, they really were demands, and Elizabeth just wasn't going to play that game.
And I suppose, again, we've said it a couple of times now, there must have the ghost of her sister must have howled by marrying the Prince of Spain, Philip, that he did have a role to play in England in a way that Elizabeth just wouldn't have tolerated. And I think that must surely have crossed her mind as well.
Absolutely. And I think, there are certain concessions that Mary had to make in order to marry Philip. And even though she was quite demanding herself in what she expected from Philip, and I think they had a great dynamic in the end, and it worked. But even though Mary's council was able to push for certain things, I do think Elizabeth's council were definitely willing to push for more. And, France wasn't willing to concede. Elizabeth wasn't willing to concede. It wouldn't have worked either way, I think.
Yeah, it's sort of, you've got this image, really. It's a bit like a sort of, lawyers today sort of going over the T's and C's, essentially, isn't it?
Yeah. Negotiations, letters. Well, we demand this. Well, we don't like that. How about this? And these negotiations went on for such a long time, and there's so much written, there's so much paperwork about this, especially in the Cecil papers, and it's just not spoken about. It's just something that we don't look about. I've seen a few books talk about Elizabeth's courtships, but this really was a really long courtship, and there's so much paperwork.
There's a lot more going on with this one.
Absolutely.
And you referenced a moment ago about the fact that they began to write to each other regularly and that a lot of these letters do survive. So what can we glean from their relationship by their writing? And is it also at this point that the frog nickname is first being used?
Yeah, well, I just want to say that obviously based on my book, the letters between Elizabeth and Anjou do survive, and they do provide a fascinating insight into the relationship. But at the beginning, I got quite lost with them because I found mostly Elizabeth's letters and was finding it very difficult. It's a bit like Henry and Anne's letters, there's no reply from Anne.
Mm-hmm.
And I was reading Elizabeth's letters, and I'm like, well, what does this mean? And what does this mean? And then I found actually, oh, Anjou's letters do exist and they're just somewhere else. And when I found them, things started to make much more sense. So basically the correspondence reveals a deep affection between the two of them. So Anjou frequently calling Elizabeth his soul's delight, and he offers her courtly flattery, very French, very very romantic in terms of what Elizabeth would have probably found romantic. But he does refer to her, in kind of like his mistress in a way. And I don't mean mistress as in maybe his bit on the side, but almost like she's the one in power. He refers to himself for, in one instance, in one letter, as her slave. And I found that's so odd, even for the 16th century. And so when I was reading this, I was like, what's going on here? But I do think these letters suggest that Elizabeth may have been more emotionally involved in the courtship than she actually done publicly. And in terms of the frog nickname, I think it doesn't really appear in the letters, but it did become associated with Anjou later. So there's, I suppose, records of Elizabeth referring to him as her frog. But then also there is, because of his French background and, the way English courtiers liked to, they liked to take the piss out of everyone. And that's how they perceived him. And they actually call him, a frog as well. But it's just a coincidence. Elizabeth called him her frog in an affectionate way. Courtiers, referred to him as a frog probably in a xenophobic way. And it's just a coincidence that, he's known as the Frog. And I just thought, this was a great title, The Frog Prince.
So it's clear that there was a lot of affection between the pair, and sort of by extension of that will have surely pleased the Queen's counsellors.
So overall, the Queen, the counsellors were pleased with the courtship, and the affection was real. It seems that, things are going well. They're writing letters. There's lots of negotiation going back and forth here. Overall, the councillors are happy for Elizabeth to marry, but they have their own contingencies. They want Elizabeth to still remain a sovereign. They want her sovereign power protected. They want Anjou to basically act as, I suppose, the way a queen would be if she married a king. And it's just not really working. And this kind of puts pressure on both of them. And you can see it in their letters as well. So while there's a deep affection there, there's also anxiety at the back of their minds. And yeah, the council were happy for them to marry until they weren't, until they can see that France is not going to concede and England doesn't want to concede. It's really complicated.
Yeah, and I suppose there's a surefire way of taking any sort of genuine romance out of something is for it to become, is to have people squabbling over terms and conditions. It's going to, so, there was this affection, but it ultimately sounds like it sort of almost gets destroyed because, and that's, I suppose, the great irony really here is that, Cecil was so desperate for Elizabeth to marry, and yet in the end, her counsellors tie things in so many knots that in a way it breaks down the relationship.
Yeah, I think I imagined multiple counsellors standing, I suppose, in a circle around the table, and Cecil kind of at the head of it. This was my going on in my imagination when I was researching, writing this, and just one person says one thing and the other brings up another thing, and then it's kind of no one can agree whether she should marry this man or not. And I think William Cecil did want her to marry. And I think he would have allowed her to marry Anjou, but nobody could agree. And because nobody could agree, this led to Elizabeth, having doubts, having anxiety. She became quite, what is referred to as melancholic over the whole situation. She couldn't sleep. And so I think there was a real spark there between them, but I think he got ruined, because of the politics.
Yeah. And how did the common English people react to the news of a potential marriage with Anjou?
That's really hard to say because, the common people, in terms of common people, if we're saying, courtiers or something a little bit lower, the gentry. I think overall, common people were largely skeptical of the match between Elizabeth and Anjou. I think that the court might have been intrigued or pleased by the flirtations and affections that the two exchanged at first. I think overall, though, most Englishmen would have viewed him with suspicion. I think there's a lot of xenophobia going on, what we would refer to as xenophobia. And I think also his French Catholic background and his perceived femininity, which is quite interesting to me.
Yeah, because that's another thing about him, isn't it? That like in the first Elizabeth film, he's portrayed as a cross-dressing, extremely effeminate gay man.
Yeah, he's actually is portrayed as a gay man and quite fluid, and dresses in women's attire. And was this common in the French court at the time? Was it not? I'm not an expert on it, but I do think that it doesn't mean he was gay. And if it's true, and he was perceived as rather feminine in the Tudor court. I mean, look at, when you think about it, the way Tudor men dress, it's lavish when we look at it now, but like it wasn't actually fabulous as the French or Spanish courts. In the French court, they really dressed to impress. They were dressed splendidly, and perhaps it was just a little bit effeminate for her. Yeah,
because actually thinking back to this Serpent Queen, Anjou's gay in that as well, isn't he? Well, hides it, but evidently depictions of him in film and television, they've kind of gone down that trope, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I noticed as well. I picked it up and I was like, oh my God, is this actually a thing throughout history where people think he's gay or think he's, he had, some sort of inclinations that, we can speculate on further? Perhaps we could. But I just think it was something that was common amongst his age group in the French court at the time.
Yeah.
And I just think Englishmen threw that out of proportion, to be honest.
Yeah. So when did Elizabeth and Anjou meet for the first time, and what do we know of how the meeting went?
So they first met in 1579. So this was his first visit to England. And this was highly formalized. This setting was absolutely to a T, like exactly what the French court, French would expect of Elizabeth's court. It was staged, it was fake, it was designed to give an impression on the French people and to give the French prince this beautiful, great impression of Elizabeth and her glittering court. And of course, he was struck by her charisma and apparently her beauty. But I do think by this time her beauty probably was, fading. Not that her charm was or her charisma. And I think that she in turn seemed to appreciate his enthusiasm for her and how youthful he was.
Yeah, because he was also actually, like Elizabeth, I believe he was actually quite badly pockmarked.
He was, yes. He also was pockmarked. And this is something I mentioned in the book that they shared. And so, the modern concept of what we say is, someone is good looking or someone isn't good looking or someone is ugly. It's not the same in the 16th century in Europe at all. So Elizabeth was still considered very beautiful, a catch, not just because she was the queen, but because of her charisma and her ability to look beautiful, to look well dressed. It's not really about her skin or if it's pockmarked or not. She is a beautiful woman despite it. And I think, and if you look at Anjou's portraits that exist, and if they are, based on life, grain of salt there, but if they are, he wasn't a bad looking man. And so even if he was pockmarked like Elizabeth, he would have still be considered beautiful by his courtiers. It's more than likely he would have been considered handsome. And I think this idea, this stain of that he was ugly, he resembled a frog, he was pockmarked, I think this is all propaganda. This is all English propaganda. And it existed, I think, even during his first visit. I think people likely commented on his appearance.
Something that I found really interesting is that you mention in the book that, and she wouldn't have known it, but really Mary Queen of Scots is the person who brings Elizabeth and Anjou together. So how so?
Well, that's interesting. So I think there's two ways to look at this. So Mary Queen of Scots, she played like this indirect but important role in bringing them together in the terms of like Mary's political situation. So her political situation in Scotland by that time is pretty much destroyed. And she has ongoing struggles with Elizabeth. there's this, diplomatic backdrop for the whole courtship between Elizabeth and Anjou, and Mary is sitting there. Mary is Elizabeth's heir. Mary is Catholic, and even though Anjou is a Catholic, if Elizabeth can marry him, and by some miracle provide England with an heir, by some miracle, or even the idea that Mary could be, pushed out of the succession, this makes Elizabeth feel very safe. So I think we have to think of it as a strategic point. At this point in the courtship, Elizabeth is thinking about the politics. She's thinking about Mary Queen of Scots in the background. She's thinking about her age, and she's thinking about the succession. And so Mary is pushing this because Elizabeth wants everyone to think that she can have an heir without Mary being in the picture. And Anjou, a young man, he's a prince, he's of royal blood, he can provide this for her. The problem is he's a Catholic, like Mary.
I see. Okay, it's so interesting. It's just it's something you I wouldn't have considered, but does make complete sense.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, Elizabeth is a woman. She does want that, that feeling of companionship. She does want to be a man to adore her. She does want to be safe in her reign. But I think for most of her reign, or definitely the last, 20 years of her reign, maybe 30, Mary Queen of Scots is there. She's constant. She does not go away. And she's Elizabeth's greatest fear. And you have to consider the anxiety that would have brought Elizabeth. And even though early on she might have been very rigid in the stance that she's never going to marry, this starts to soften when, there's this Catholic heir sitting in the background waiting for you to die. So, yeah, I think it changed her.
So how serious do you think Elizabeth genuinely was in wanting the marriage to go ahead with Anjou? And do you think Anjou felt the same way?
Well, during my writing of this book, I wanted to prove definitively that Elizabeth fell in love with Anjou. And I think, it's impossible. But I really, based on my studies of the history of the emotions, I really wanted to grasp at something here. But all I found was, while that she was fond of him, it's really hard to say if she ever even truly seriously thought about marrying him. She enjoyed his attention. She enjoyed the diplomatic leverage and the courtship and, the gifts and all of the glitter of it. But I think she likely feared the consequences of marriage, both personally and politically, more than she liked the idea of marrying him. And I think for Anjou, I think he was genuinely interested in Elizabeth, personally. I think his persistence and romantic overtures should suggest that he was deeply invested in the idea of marrying her, even though he knew the difficulties and the opposition that stood in the way of them. So I think he was more interested in her than she was interested in him, but I think ultimately both parties were caught between romantic interest and, the political realities and ramifications of their courtship.
I see, okay. He did return, though, to England for a second trip. So how did that one differ from the first?
It's very different, actually. So he returned to England for a second visit in 1581. It's not, it's not showy. It's not up in the air. It's not a massive celebration. It's actually more secretive. But this trip was more serious, and it focused on really finalizing the terms of the marriage. So even though Elizabeth still is kind of in the back of her head saying, oh no, like I like him, I want him, but I don't want this. The first visit had been more about the courtship and the charm. But by 1581, the situation became more formal. It's politically charged. Yes, they're writing letters, but they're both getting frustrated with each other in their letters. You can see it. And then there's also the English court. So they were way less welcoming this time. And because of this, Elizabeth's hesitation is just evident. The public perception of Anjou had changed, and the second visit became marked by, I suppose, more political negotiation and less about, their personal feelings.
See, okay. And I suppose by extension of this, despite the council's desperation for Elizabeth to marry, they are ultimately instrumental in blocking the Anjou marriage from taking place. So how did this opposition arise, and why?
I think the opposition from Elizabeth's council arose probably from concerns about the political ramifications of the marriage rather than, whether he was like a good guy or whether he was, a Catholic. I just think,
yes, it wasn't personal to him.
Yeah, they're thinking about the after. They're thinking about what this is going to do, and they're thinking about Mary I as well. So while some of her advisors were initially, supportive of the match, the longer the negotiations went on, the more they realised that the marriage to a Catholic French prince would be dangerous for England overall, even though, Spain was a threat at this point. They feared that Anjou's influence could undermine Protestantism in England, and that eventually would lead to political instability. But I think that many members of the council had doubts about Anjou's maturity and actually his capability as, a co-sovereign, a co-ruler. And I think it's down to the politics as much as it is down to him. And it just was never going to fly.
So in the end, it's Elizabeth who, as best we can tell, ends any prospect of the marriage taking place. So what drove her to this decision, and how do we know of how Anjou reacted?
Yeah, it's a little bit like, sending like a text, it's over.
It's not you, it's me.
It's not you, it's me. It's not Francis England, and it's, her decision to end, the prospect of marriage with him was driven by her growing reluctance and her anxiety to give up her power and sovereignty. Ultimately, she knew she couldn't do it. I think she realized that any marriage would diminish her independence and that she was pretty much unwilling to surrender control to any man, not just a foreign prince. And as for Anjou's reaction, he was really, really disappointed. I think he eventually accepted the decision and tried to turn his focus elsewhere. So, he pursued other political matches within France. He was looking towards the Netherlands politically. But I just think overall he was devastated by it, and he tried to make it look like in his letters that he wasn't. But then at the same time, he's telling her, he's happy to, for England and France to remain good friends, but at the same time, his heart is broken. And so he's very dramatic about it, but then he's also trying to control the narrative himself.
Do you think he was genuinely devastated because of his feelings for Elizabeth? Or do you think there was quite a large portion of the sadness was that he wouldn't have such a big, powerful position in England as well?
I think it's both. I think we have to be careful here because, I've a lot of historians have said that it's simply down to the political, so that he's upset because he's already a fourth son, he's already a third or fourth son, he's down the line of succession. He is a possible heir for his brother, but that's not secure. We don't know what's going to happen. He doesn't know what's going to happen, and so he's kind of a prince without a land of his own. He really has no home. And this is also what's driving him towards the Netherlands as well. So he really doesn't have anywhere to base himself. He doesn't have any power. He doesn't have any real wealth besides that what comes from his family. He doesn't have independence, and he really wants that. And I think Elizabeth represents that for him. But we also have to remember that based on what he's writing, and if it's to be believed, he cared about her, and he genuinely could see himself in some sort of partnership her, in a marriage with her, and that has to be considered.
So, despite the big age gap, it's actually the Duke of Anjou that predeceases Elizabeth. He dies at quite a young age. So, how did he die, and how did Elizabeth react to that, and how did she remember him, I suppose, throughout the rest of her days?
He died around the age of 31. It's 1584, so he's 31, and the way he died it's kind of a mystery. So it's either cancer, it's malaria, or it's even typhoid. I think it's more likely to be malaria, but other historians, would say it's more likely to be cancer. And Elizabeth was deeply saddened by his death. Her reaction was more restrained than I think you would expect, considering that they were possibly going to be married, and she had invested emotionally in the courtship for a long time. I think overall for her, it's a reminder of the fragility of life and of love, especially for a monarch like herself who is alone on a throne. So, yeah, it devastated her, but she controlled it to an extent.
Yeah, but am I correct in saying that she carried a portrait of him for the rest of her days?
Yes, there is reports that she carried a little portrait of him on, on her, I think it was like a girdle, like her
Girdle.
belt for the rest of her life. And I found two sources referencing that. So it's quite possible she did. She also wore black for 6 months, and she also strangely referred to herself as a widow, which is quite, I found quite odd, even for the time. Apparently she, she would rail, have moments of, outbursts of tears, and she would wear black, and she would act as if she had been widowed. And the next moment she was, she was happy, she's dancing, she's acting like, like it's another day at her court. So it's difficult to say how she really felt, but I think she did feel sad that he had died.
Well, my final question for you is, you sort of alluded to it earlier as being almost impossible to answer, but is what is your opinion on who is the love of Elizabeth's life? Is it Robert Dudley, as we're led to believe, or do you think that title should really go to Anjou? Where do you stand?
Again, this question is really difficult because I think both Dudley and Anjou played a significant role in Elizabeth's emotional life, but they're very different. So, Robert Dudley was her constant companion. They knew each other for almost their whole lives. He's her confidant. But in his relationship with Elizabeth, it's marred by political difficulties and his own involvements and his scandals, with his marriages and his, he's not really great at making Elizabeth trust him, despite her affection for him. And Anjou, by contrast, he's the one who Elizabeth entertained as, a serious marriage prospect. And there seems to be more genuine affection between them. But I think her role as monarch meant that she had to keep her personal feelings in check, most of the time. So it's hard to really say who was the love of her life.
Yeah, and I think, to your point, they were such different, very, very different men, but also very different circumstances, because Dudley is... Yeah. I feel like Dudley, he is known as her favourite, and I think that's probably was the case. And that, whereas Anjou, it was this maybe slightly later in life flirtation and sort of romance, that maybe she didn't have a romance with Dudley. It was a companionship thing that I think... Had their worlds been different, had they not been who they were, probably, yes, they would have married. But with Anjou, it's a different thing.
Yeah, with Anjou, there's the possibility to marry him. There's never really the possibility to marry Robert Dudley. And, he's her confidant. They're very close friends. They maybe at the beginning, maybe when they're very young, they did have some affection for each other. That's really, that began out of, love. But I think by the end of Robert Dudley's life, they're just very, very, very good friends, and they have great love for each other. And I just think Anjou was, he's the one that got away. But
absolutely,
to answer the question, I think the love of Elizabeth's life was.
You think the love of Elizabeth's life was Elizabeth?
Yes, I think overall Elizabeth put Elizabeth first, and she was right to do so because both men were great men, but both could have ruined her.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and having a talk today about this courtship. It's that I've learned a lot here, and I think to your point, it's a window of Elizabeth's reign and a relationship that just is often reduced down to sort of a sentence or two. And actually, based on everything you've said, this was a much bigger part of her story than we're led to believe.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me to talk about it.
Very welcome. So what are you, where can people find you on social media, and what are you working on at the moment, if you're allowed to say? Yeah, so I'm on Instagram, so you can find me on Instagram. It's David Lee Historian 93. And I'm currently writing a novel. I can say that. I can say I'm writing a historical novel, and it is Tudor. And unfortunately, that's all I can give away, but... I think the last time I chatted to you, I did give a hint towards it, but I'm not sure if anyone got it. But we'll see. Maybe we'll talk about it again soon. I see. Okay. Well, thank you again for coming on the Tudor Chess podcast, and we'll speak soon. Thank you so much. And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and a big thank you to David Lee for coming on to the show to discuss the Duke of Anjou and Elizabeth I with me. Next week, I'm pleased to be welcoming back historian and author Sylvia Barbara Soberton onto the show to discuss her latest book, Secrets of the Tudor Portraits, in which we will discuss some of the lesser-known facts or stories about some of the Tudors' most iconic and lesser-known images. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess Podcast, and speak soon.